I'm from Henderson, North Carolina, but I have gleaned a little bit of information about the area. On the other hand, I have to balance that with people who maybe have not been here that long and don't know the place, every little country road and every little bit of the community. And so I try to have a balance to just, some of this will be new to you, some of this will not be new to you. Today, I want to talk about Stovall and the history of Stovall. Just a couple of things just right off the bat. Stovall has had 3 different names. It was originally Sassafras Fork. For a short time in 1890, 1891, it was called Albion, which is the Latin word for bright. And then the name went back to Stovall. When I was doing research for this, I just read you something here that just really struck me as interesting. In 1910, Stovall had a population in their corporate limits of 305. As of 2020, they have 324. Over 110 years, they've grown by 19 people, which averages out to about 2 people a decade. And if you think that's something, in 1920, there were 414. In 1930, there were 415. In 1940, there were 415. In 1950, there were 410. I'm astonished. It must be the most consistently populated place in the United States. Actually, it's a little bit deceiving because Stovall really hit its stride in the early 20th century. Actually, the high population was in 1960 with 470 people. Some of you probably know this. People ride through Stovall on their way to going down Highway 15 hither and thither. But Stovall, at one point, has had a funeral home. They've had doctors. They had a bank. They had a barrel factory, a lumber factory, a mattress factory, a brick factory. And if you get a chance, take a look at this Stovall brick. It was made here in Stovall by the Stovall Brick Company around the turn of the century. The community has had, of course, a railroad. It's had newspapers, its own newspapers. It's had a hotel, post offices, multiple churches, barber shops, drug stores, had a plow factory, had a blacksmith shop. There was even, and this really surprised me, there was even a small gauge lumber railroad that ran from Stovall up to Grassy Creek. And supposedly stuck in the woods somewhere, there's a little train engine between here and Grassy Creek. If you ever come across it, let me know. I'd be really interested in that one. Where are we? Stovall is in Sassafras Fork Township. It's located in the about midway south, southern part of Sassafras Fork Township. We're talking about Stovall today, but we also want to talk about some communities that are associated with it. There's Bullock, of course. And before there was Bullock, there was a precursor community about 1.5 miles, 2 miles east of Bullock called Bullock's Crossroads. Grassy Creek, also known early on as Brownsville, is located in Sassafras Fork Township. There was a community at the far northwestern corner of Sassafras Fork Township called Callahan, also called Noblin at one point. There was actually a post office there. Also, if we're going to talk about this area, we really kind of need to throw in Sedan, Virginia. It's just over the line in southern Mecklenburg County, but it lays south of the Roanoke River and Grassy Creek, and so it was kind of cut off from the rest of Mecklenburg County. It's more associated with Granville County. Of course, today there's nothing there. So that's a little bit of background so far as the community itself. Sassafras Fork, originally the community was called Sassafras Fork. I've seen actually reference to that as early as the 1780s. Supposedly right there where the crossroads is, about where the Family Dollar is, there was a large sassafras tree, and it was a fork in the road. Of course, this was a major crossroads for its time and era. The east-west Stagecoach Road in colonial times on up until the early 20th century was the Hyco Road. Now, there was also the Indian trading path, which you might be familiar with, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Okay, of course, Native Americans, indigenous people were here first. They first make an appearance in this area about 8,000 years ago. They're mostly hunter-gatherers. They actually settle down and start farming in a big way about 1500 BC, or about 3,500 years ago. And they start using hunting as kind of a supplement to their way of gathering food, and they start to exist in smaller permanent communities. The most prominent example is Occaneechi Island up here, which is under Carr Lake now, but you may be familiar with that. That was located just across the river from Clarksville, and that was a major indigenous center for indigenous peoples. Just a few things here. This is actually a bowl that's made out of clay-fired bowls. You found a lot of pottery shards for clay in this vicinity. I found them up on Grassy Creek, found them on Carr Lake. Of course, we've all, I'm sure, over the years, everybody's found an arrowhead or seen one in a tobacco field. This is a particularly interesting example. I collected about 3,500 to 3,700 arrowheads myself over the years, and you find that you can start to tell things about people. And for instance, this person that made this arrowhead is right-handed. Arrowheads usually have a front and a back, and you can tell, look at how much more detailed the work is on this side than on that side. And so you subconsciously, when you're making an arrowhead or drawing or writing a letter, doing anything, you subconsciously kind of favor whatever whether you're left-handed or right-handed. Now, and this is a little small bird point. I found this not too long ago. By the time that Europeans come here, the Native American population, 90% of it has died off. They were already, before people came here from Virginia, most Native Americans had passed on. They did not have resistance to diseases such as tuberculosis, smallpox, typhoid, things like that. They were also not hunting large game anymore. They were hunting smaller game, rabbits, things like that. That's why their projectile points were so small. The trading path. The trading path was a north-south route that ran from the middle of North Carolina, about the Hillsborough area, came up, followed basically what's Highway 15 today. In this area, it follows 15 up till you get to about Lewis, and then it takes kind of a detour and follows about 2 to 3 miles to the west of Highway 15. You can actually follow it. You can follow it. This is off of Sam Young Road. I bet you can follow it. You can see the depressions in the ground. This map will show a little bit better. Here's the railroad, Highway 15. Here's Stovall. You see this dotted line right there? That's the trading path. And I just want to point out something on this map too. Prior to the coming of the railroad comes through this area in Stovall in 1888. And I will say unequivocally, it's probably the single most important event that's ever happened in the history of Stovall, and probably Granville County, because it represented such a change. It opened the area up to the wider world. It increased transportation. It led to industry. It led to a better ability, if you're a farmer, and everybody here was a farmer back then, to get your goods to market. But prior to that, the main road, you see this road right here? This is the Taylor's Ferry Road. It went up to the Roanoke River. There was no railroad, there was no Highway 15. That's why this community right here that I mentioned earlier, the Bullock's Crossroads, different from the community of Bullock. Okay, and you can actually still trace this. If you look on a Google map, you can still trace this with fence lines and property lines and things like that. Also, I want to mention while I have this map here that there was a railroad that ran from Manson, North Carolina to Clarksville and cut across through Townsville. Have any of you ever heard of the Townsville Railroad? Yes, there was a railroad in Townsville. Matter of fact, the community was called Linesville, but the Towns family donated the land and right-of-way for the railroad in 1855. Hence, the community became Townsville. And that pattern will repeat itself frequently as you study local history. In any event, the railroad came across right over this little part of what is now Granville County. Something to keep in mind as you study local history, Granville County, as many of you may know, was a mother county in 1746. Parts of Person County, Warren County, Granville County, present-day Granville County, Vance County, and Franklin County all came out of the original, what I call Old Granville County. Granville County was divided in 1763 into Granville County and Butte County. In 1779, Butte County was split into Warren and Franklin County, and then in 1881, Vance County was formed mostly from Granville County, but it included parts of Warren County and Franklin County. I know this sounds complicated, but I had someone I was talking to not too long ago that was doing genealogy work, and they said, "Gosh, my family moved around so much." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, first they were in Granville County, then they moved to Butte County, and then moved to Warren County, and then later on their descendants moved to Vance County." I said, "They never moved." So anyway, that's the area, the trading path, crossed the trading path, and of course, as European settlers came here, they followed the old trading path, and there was the east-west stagecoach road or Hico road. Where they crossed is right out there. Or more to the point, actually, it's technically more about 2 miles that way, where the old trading path crossed over. Hart's Crossroads is actually the name of it. But anyway, you get the idea that this is a crossroads of real significance. Now look, in the 1730s and 1740s, people started coming here from Virginia. Virginia was getting crowded. 95% of the people that come to Granville County and settle in this area prior to the Civil War come from Virginia. Okay? It just is a matter of convenience. Now, Lord Granville owned the property that is now Granville County. I'm sure that would have been news to the people who actually lived here, like the Native Americans. But anyway, he had seen that he had been given a grant. His grandfather had been given a grant from Charles II as a Lord Proprietor, and he received the northern part of what is now North Carolina in payment for his services to reestablish the monarchy after the English Civil War. When people, he has all this land, he goes into the land business. Now, Lord Granville never sets foot in North America. He sends agents here to sell property. You can get what's called a quit rent. Basically, I did the math on it. You pay $2.10. That was what it was in 1750. Equivalent to $2.10 quit rent every year, and after 20 years, it's your property. Okay. Now, the more people you bring with you when you come here and settle, the more land that you can get from a quit rent. They were in lots of 640 acres, which is a square mile. So a lot of times families would come here in the overcrowded areas of Virginia. They would come to this area. They would buy lots of land. They would bring their families with them, their relatives, their friends, and their enslaved people. In this area, prior to the American Revolution, about 25% of the population was enslaved. By 1860, the population of Granville County is about 23,000. Out of those 23,000, about 11,000 are enslaved people. So the population goes from being about 25% African American to over 50% African American, because in addition to the enslaved people that are here, you also have a large free black population. By 1870, Granville County is 65% African American. And it's interesting because that dynamic has switched to this day. This percentage is about 35, 65 African American to other races. Now, I bring this up because this has particular significance for this area. One of the unusual things about Granville County is that the slave plantation system developed here to a degree that it did not in other places in North Carolina. You saw it a lot down east around Orton Plantation, Berkeley County, places like that. But you didn't see it in the Piedmont that much. But here in Granville County, particularly in the northern part of the county, and particularly in Sassafras Fort Township, you had tobacco grew really well here. Now, this is before flue-cured tobacco really got big after the American Civil War. This is in colonial times when the area is being settled. Tobacco being a little bit different than it is now, or was even during flue cure times, you would actually cut the whole stalk of tobacco and grind it all up and put it into these cake-like things. It was called plug tobacco. There was no such thing as a cigarette. You either used it in a pipe or you chewed it. Cut you some tobacco. And there were lots of little small tobacco factories. So there was a crop here. It's interesting because in 1860, in this district, now let me throw this at you. Sassafras, sometimes this township was called Sassafras Fort, sometimes it was called Abrams Plains Township. Abrams Plains, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, being a large plantation in this area. Okay, of all the townships in Granville County in 1860, Abrams Plains or Sassafras Fort Township, what's now Sassafras Fort Township, had 1,107 slave people, far more than any other township in this county, or for that matter, in any surrounding counties. And to just give you some statistical information, the largest slave owner was a man named James Cooper. He owned 100 slaves. The Gregory family owned something like, collectively, 8 members of that family owned something like 150 slaves. Okay, so that is the way this area developed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these large plantations. This is kind of typical right here. Some of these plantations are still here. Most of them are gone, neglected from time, changing economies, things like that. Benign neglect. I would have to show you this. Is an amazing picture. This came from the Chesley Daniel family papers at UNC. This is the only picture that I know. These are 3 enslaved people that were remembered that were with the Daniel and Bullock family, Jim, Rose, and Lawson. This picture was taken about 1870. This is after they had been emancipated. Mentioned Red Hill, large plantation almost up in Virginia, north of Bullock. Somebody called this the telescope house because it's, big, smaller, small. This area was built by the Mitchell family about 1770. It's really unique. This is the only gambrel roof house in Old Granville County, or in Granville County. Gambrel roof being this distinctive barn shape. This part was built in the early 1800s. This part was built about 1830. Probably in colonial times, when after this area had been developed, going into the antebellum days after the American Revolution, John Penn was probably the wealthiest person in Sassafras Fort Township. He owned about 4,300 acres. He had about 26 or 27 slaves. I saw in the 1788 tax list. Of course, he's famous for something. And with a name like Penn, he'd probably be famous for signing something. And of course, as you know, he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. He moved here from Caroline County, Virginia in 1774. He was only here 2 years. He got elected to the state, the colonial assembly, what we would call the state legislature now. And he was picked as one of North Carolina's 3 delegates to go to Philadelphia to represent North Carolina in Congress. He was a compromise candidate. Of the 3 people that were picked, they were all Easterners. They were all wealthy. It was decided as a matter of political expedience to have someone from the backcountry, to have someone who was poor to go serve in Congress. He was one of the poorest. I mean, he owned 27 slaves and had thousands of acres of land. He was still one of the poorest signers of the Declaration of Independence. His best friend was a man named Thomas Person. Thomas Person was the real mover and shaker here in Granville County. He was the wealthiest person in Granville County. He owned about 85,000 acres of land total in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. Very wealthy man. First sheriff. He was sheriff for a while. He was the principal surveyor and one of the main land agents for Lord Granville. And from time to time, you might see me do my interpretation of John Penn. But I think it really speaks well of Stovall and this vicinity. Just think about it, y'all. How many places can claim a signer of the Declaration of Independence? It was originally buried out here at past Michael Creek Church, back off that way. And the plantation house was called Longview. It burned about 1912. Penn's remains were exhumed and removed to Guilford Courthouse in 1893. His wife and one of his children is still buried out there. There are about 40 slave graves out there as well. John Penn from this area. Got to mention another important person that was in early development in this area, a man named Henry Patillo. Henry Patillo was a Presbyterian minister. He preached for about 20 years at Grassy Creek Presbyterian Church. And let me just say right off the bat, there's Grassy Creek Baptist Church and there's Grassy Creek Presbyterian Church. Okay? Sometimes that can be a little confusing when you're doing local history. Henry Patillo lived at a place called Somerset. This place stood until about 2011, 2012. He was also a school teacher. One of the outbuildings, I think, is still standing. Now, but anyway, this was the first school building in Granville County that we know of. He conducted classes from here. He also he was the first person from Granville County to ever write a book and publish a book. He published several books. Mostly they were textbooks on geography and religion. The first book he ever published, y'all ready? A geographical cataclysm to assist those who have neither maps nor gazetteers to read newspapers, history, or travels with as much of the science of astronomy and the doctrine of the air, I don't even know what that is, as to be judged sufficient for a farmer who wishes to understand something of the works of God. And I think that was published, let's see, that was in 1786. And another important early person in this area, let's talk about churches. It's a good time to talk about churches. Here are some of the early churches in this area. They're among the very earliest churches in Granville County. Cameron, what did we say, 1754? 1754 for Grassy Creek Baptist Church. Of course, this is not the original building, but
that's the third building.
Third building. This is basically the oldest Baptist church in this part of North Carolina and one of the very oldest in the state of North Carolina. Still going strong. This is Shiloh Church. It was originally Shiloh Meeting House. This was located a few miles west of Stovall. Find my particulars on this. About 1820, it was a meeting house. Starting in 1834, it was a Presbyterian church. It was the main Presbyterian church in this vicinity until 1889. In that year, the building itself was moved to Bullock and was closed by 1915. The cemetery is still there. I wish I had a better picture of it, but this is the best picture I had. There was a preacher here named Reverend Edward Hines that was very involved in the Presbyterian church. Another one is Grassy Creek Presbyterian Church. This is not the original location. It was located back towards Gila. This is about mid-1750s. This was the very first Presbyterian church in this vicinity, and Nutbush over in Townsville opened shortly after that. Also want to mention St. Peter's. And by the way, this is the John Penn marker in front of it. St. Peter's was started about 1870 by the 1879 by the Gregory family. It was a local Episcopal church, a very small church. It survived until about 1970 when it was deconsecrated, and it's still here. It was originally owned by a member of the Gregory family, a lady named Nancy Shank, who I want to acknowledge. I never met her, but her generosity with the library has preserved thousands of papers and thousands of words and dozens of books that she had the foresight to make sure that were donated to the Granville County Library System. And she deserves real kudos for that. Talk about some of the old houses in the area, these large plantations. It's interesting. Back in these days, some of these plantations were so large, Abrams Plains, Waterloo, Brownsville, they were communities in and of themselves. They had their own blacksmith shop. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved people working there. There were thousands of acres. They had their own post offices. Abrams Plains Post Office opened in 1841. It's the first post office in this vicinity. In 1852, the post office moved to Sassafras Fork. It moved here. But it was originally located at Abrams Plains. This back part of this house was built about 1766 by a man named Samuel Smith. It's named Abrams Plains because he was a veteran of the Battle of Abrams Plains, which was the pivotal battle during the French and Indian War. If the British hadn't won that battle, we'd probably all be speaking French today. It ensured that the 13 colonies would be English, and that the British Empire in North America would supersede the French Empire. This plantation has the largest, this is a huge plantation. It's got the largest private cemetery that I know of in Granville County. There are probably about 500 people buried in the slave cemetery out there. And that was used up until the probably early 20th century. I'll just tell you the story about this real quick. Best genealogist I ever knew was a man named Kenneth Smith. He lived out in Tennessee. His ancestors were Smiths. I was going to go see the cemetery one day because your family had invited me out there. And Mr. Smith said to me, he said, well, I know there's about 500 graves out there, but there's only 2 marked graves. And if I remember right, one of them, I think his name is Squire Dunstan. So I went to go see the cemetery, and sure enough, there was a man named Squire Durham. Not Dunstan, but Durham that was buried out there. And, Jonathan said, he said, well, I hadn't been out there since 1968, so that's all I might not get it right? So I thought, good gracious. He went to visit the cemetery half a century ago, and he can still remember the guy's name that was on it, well, close to it, Squire Dunstan. So I went out there, came back home, there was a message on my answering machine. Mark, this is Ken. I just want you to know, I don't think his name was Dunstan. I think his last name was Durham. And sure enough, it was Durham. He remembered that. A lot of the area in the Stovall, we owe a lot that we know about the history of it to a man named Presley Davis. The same family, incidentally, descendants of the Smith families through the Davises lived there at this place to this very day. Presley Davis was, again, another person who preserved a lot of history, donated a lot of things to the library, wrote a lot of stuff down. He's an interesting fellow in and of himself. He was a surveyor by profession. He worked on the Blue Ridge Parkway. He was an engineer, excellent genealogist, and I love showing these things off because, here, I'm going to let you grab one end of this, all right? Since you're related to him. He did genealogy charts. He drew these out by hand. Look at the meticulous detail on this. I've got 24 more of these at the library. It's unbelievable.
Not just of our family, but other families as well.
Yeah, I mean, and what you do is you find out where you are, and then you trace it back to your father, your grandfather, great-grandfather, all the way back to merry old England. Just amazing. These are works of art in and of themselves. I always like to point out Mr. Davis's good works and the works that he did. Very unusual man. He also has the distinction of being the first patient at the new Duke Hospital, which was what, about 1970
something?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Also, Abrams Plains had the largest pecan tree east of the Mississippi. And look, it stood until about 20 years ago. You can't get an idea of the scale on it, but check this out. You see that? That's a yardstick. That'll give you some idea how large. I think it was something like 13 and a half feet in circumference. Abrams Plains. Another local plantation is the Gregory Plantation. This is Elmwood. This was built about 1805 by the Lewis family. Later on in the 1860s, it was purchased by the Gregory family. You'll hear me mention the Gregory family a lot. This house was in as bad a shape as I've ever seen a house in my life, and it was restored. And it was the interior work on this house is just excellent.
Enjoying it, but I haven't been.
Okay, I understand. Also, I wanted to point out one interesting thing that's been done lately. The last owner of this property spent a great deal of time and effort and money to get the slave cemetery with ground penetration radar, and they have found 66 graves buried in there. And we're currently working on a project to we won't probably ever be able to patch the graves with the exact names, but we've been working on finding out some of the people that were buried there. Elmwood. Hillary, another Gregory family, old home. It doesn't look like this now, but these pictures were taken in the 1950s. And you can see it had these beautiful gardens here. And it has also one of two mills, grist mills that are still standing in Granville County. This was built about 1848 by Mr. Gregory. He hired a man who went around Granville County, old Granville County, building mills, and his name was Stark. There are several Stark mills, there are several Gregory mills here in Granville County. Just want to mention Hill. Oh, by the way, the Francis Gregory that lived here, it's an interesting phenomenon. Francis Gregory had a son named Herbert. Herbert had a son named Francis. Francis had a son named Herbert. Two of the Gregory family members, this is William T. Gregory, and this is Francis Gregory. They moved to Canada in the late 1800s, about 1899, and started the tobacco industry in Canada. And how many of you ever had ancestors or relatives that went and worked in tobacco in Canada? Both my grandparents did. They're responsible for introducing tobacco to Canada. Incidentally, William T. Gregory was born in the United States, but he became a Canadian citizen. Consequently, when World War I started, he volunteered to serve, Canada being part of the British Empire at the time, and he became the first North Carolinian to participate in the First World War. People from this area that went out into the wider world and made a difference. Another one is Mr. Pratt Winston. He lives in a house called Rose Hill, which is just north of Grassy Creek. This is the oldest brick house in Granville County. This was built by the Speed family, about 1848. I gotta mention this. When I was young and in art school and starving and needed a job, and you don't make a lot of money when you're an artist and young, I can tell you that. They were nice enough to commission me to draw their house. This is one of my very first paintings, pen and inks that I ever did. Pratt he's an inventor. He basically invented the boombox, or the multi-use boombox. This is something he designed. He marketed this about 1970. It's called the Weltron 2001. It has speakers on it. It has a AM, FM radio, and it has an 8-track tape player in it. And later on, he expanded that to include cassettes and, of course, CDs and things like that. Again, another person from this area that went out and did other things. In addition to some of the impressive houses, we have Stoughton's Mill. There's several old mills in this area. There's about 4 Gregory mills. There's about 3 Stark mills that I know of. Probably the most impressive of them was Stoughton's Mill, located a few miles west of this area. It actually had 4 stories. It was one of the largest and oldest mills in North Carolina. Unfortunately, it was not preserved. And I just like to always point this out when I'm talking about old buildings and architecture in this area, because it was significant and it's a prime example of what we've lost. Also, another mill, this is at the end of, near where John Penn is buried. This is the remains of the old Gregory's mill that's on Gillis Creek, which is on John Penn's old property. You can still see the foundations here. I want to talk about Triple Oaks. This is Reverend Mr. Hines that I talked about, that was the Presbyterian minister that was involved in Grassy Creek Presbyterian Church, and then later on Shiloh. He also moved to Henderson at one point and helped found the Presbyterian Church there. Got to mention Abrams Watkins Venable. He lived in a plantation house called Brownsville, which had its first post. It had a post office in 1806. It's the 3rd post office in Granville County. Today, the community is Grassy Creek. That post office existed until 1905. It was there 99 years. Abrams Watkins Venable was a congressman. He was probably the most important political figure in this area prior to the Civil War. During the American Civil War, he served in the Confederate Congress. He was a big advocate of secession in the Confederacy. His home was called Brownsville. I don't know if this is a typo or not, but it's kind of interesting. It's Brownsville, the Venerable home. His name was Venable, not Venerable. But apparently that was his venerable old home. But he probably, by the way, this is also the oldest image that I know of someone from Granville County. This daguerreotype was taken probably about 1847, 48, by a famous photographer named Matthew Brady. This is when he was serving in Congress. Venable took a lot of risk politically and economically. He was very wealthy. He's probably the wealthiest man in Granville County. At one point, when he died in 1876, he was destitute. He was broke. He also made probably the worst political prediction in United States history. He believed that the South would leave the Union and would go on its way and form its own country without being molested by the Union. And he stood in Congress and took out his handkerchief and said, "The coming war, I will wipe up all the blood in the coming war with this handkerchief." And he was wrong. Someone from this area, again, got to mention another great old house is Crystal Hill. This was built about 1854 by a man named Thomas Jefferson Gregory. This is Mount Airy. This is the home of the Baskervilles. This is Major George T. Baskerville. He died at Gettysburg on July the 2nd, 1863. The story is always told that his wife was so heartbroken and prostrate with grief that she died of a broken heart a month later. And sure enough, if you go back and look, she died in August of 1863. Which does bring us, this kind of brings us to the American Civil War. Of course, in this area, in Granville County, and true in a lot of places in the South, particularly North Carolina and Virginia, if you took all the people who died in all the wars, people from Granville County, the revolution through all the way up to the war in Afghanistan, except in the Civil War, if you took that number and quadrupled it, you still wouldn't get the number of people who died in the American Civil War from Granville County. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 550 to 600 people died in the Civil War. Something like 10% of the entire adult white male population between the ages of 16 and 60. Roughly, I mean, we don't know exactly, but I'm just basing that off of what I've done over the years in doing genealogical research. So obviously it affected this area greatly. Of course, it meant the end of the slave system. When you're in a place like Sassafras Fork and you have such a large number of people that were enslaved, where are they going to work? How are they going to make a living? And this is where the sharecropping or crop lien system comes into effect after the American Civil War. Now, some of you may be familiar with it. Basically, sharecropping works something like this. You don't have anything. All you can offer is your labor. You get someone who they provide you with seed, they provide you with tools, they provide you with land, they provide you with a place to stay. And at the end of the season, they get half of your crop and you get half of your crop. Okay? Tenant farming is another aspect of it. But here's the bad thing about it. In a lot of ways, it's economic slavery. Because if you don't have anything, and a lot of times you can't get credit, so you get credit at the store of the person that you're sharecropping with. And I have seen even cases in the 1970s when I worked at a little country store. People would work in tobacco, they work, and at the end of the year they get paid, and they go in the store or to pay what you owe for sharecropping, and you're still in debt. And you're going to be in debt the next year, and the next year, and the year after that. Something like 70% of African Americans from 1870 to 1930 in North Carolina, something like 70% of African Americans were involved in sharecropping, something like 30% of the white population was also in sharecropping. So this is a system where it's very difficult to break out of it. And by the way, some of these images were taken in the 1930s. If they look like those WPA famous photographers like Frank Delano and Margaret Bourke-White and Dorothea Lange, the reason why is that's who they are. They came here to Granville County and took a lot of these pictures, these what I call Dust Bowl pictures, that we've seen a lot in American history textbooks and things like that. And these images were all taken in Granville County. Farming with a mule, a well, ceramic well, brown, just like my granny had. The ceramic well, a slide, tobacco slide. That was life for a lot of people back then. Incidentally, talking about religion, after the enslaved people were freed, a lot of people don't realize African Americans and white people went to church together prior to the Civil War. That changed after the war. The members of the black community, by and large, went and formed their own churches. Some of the more prominent ones in this vicinity are Michael's Creek Church, which was formed about 1868. You also have, this is First Baptist Church here in Stovall. That was formed about 1890. You have Davis Chapel, which was formed in the 1890s. This is Zor Church. This was formed about 1904. Incidentally, there was another Zor Church here that was started in Stovall in the 1870s, but it was a white church, but it didn't last very long. Where you find an African-American church in Granville County, you find this man. This is Walter Patillo. He was involved in something like 14 different churches that he either helped form or was the driving force for or preached at. So we certainly want to mention Mr. Patillo, Reverend Patillo. Some other churches in the area, Bullock Baptist Church, 1904. This is Stovall Baptist. Let's see what the date is on Stovall Baptist. It's 1886. This is the new building for Stovall Methodist. Stovall Methodist was, it's interesting, you can't mention that without mentioning Reverend John Young, who for 42 years was the preacher there. He basically was the church. He holds the record. I think there's no one in Methodist church history in the United States that preached at one church longer than he did. He preached there for 42 years. You know, most of the time, particularly Methodists, they'll move you around. You're a preacher. Have to mention that. Not every old house was grand and great. This is a house that stood on I think it was on Mountain Creek Road. This was built by a man named General Thomas Smith, who was just a poor farmer, but he always wanted to have a big house, big mansion house on the hill. So he took two of his tobacco barns and kind of put some chimneys on it and built this. I think it's very impressive. When the railroad first comes through this area in 1880, at this point, this area is called Sassafras Fork. The railroad is coming from Clarksville going to Durham. In 1888, a local man named John Walker Stovall, who also built this very fine, nice old house in 1834, he donates the land and right-of-way for the railroad to come through this area. As a consequence, when the station opens in 1888, it's called Stovall in his honor, and the community's name is changed. The post office name is changed from Sassafras Fork to Stovall. John Walker Stovall had two sons that died in the American Civil War. Here's the railroad station, which stopped here until 1964. This is the train coming from Durham heading to Stovall. As I mentioned before, it changed a lot of things. This is Willis White's hotel. This is built about 1905. Willis White was the station master and an agent for Southern Railroad. Mr. Williford is fixing this house up. By the way, this gentleman right here, this man named Ulysses Puckett, some of you might know his name. He's well known for his drugstore here. Stovall had two newspapers, actually. They had the Stovall Courier about 1899, and at one point when I told you the community was called Albion for a short time period, there was the Albion Banner. Of course, this was published by R.T. Gregory. Got to mention this, too. There was briefly, in the late 1800s up until the 1930s, this area, particularly in Piedmont, North Carolina, and Southside Virginia, was part of what they call the mineral water belt. And there were a lot of places that sold and bottled mineral water. And one in particular, you had Panacea Springs in Warren County. You had, Buffalo Springs up in Mecklenburg County, which was a big deal. I was doing some research on that. Let me tell you a story about a man named Jed. The director for entertainment in Buffalo Springs, and they would get hundreds of people come there in the summer, you know, it was Buddy Ebsen's father, a guy who played Jed Clinton. And so he actually got his start in show business up in Buffalo Junction. I said, Buddy went from Buffalo Junction to Beverly Hills to Barnaby Jones, but he got his start up at Buffalo Junction. But I bring that up because there were several places in Granville County, Smith Springs over Berea, Buckhorn Springs, which was just west of east of Bullock. They actually were in business till 1941. The mineral springs opened in 1904. Just wanted to show you a few things. This was a display. The address was Henderson, but each one of those is bottled water from Buffalo Lithia Springs. The water was advertised as being beneficial treatment for catarrh of the stomach. It aided the bowels. It prevented constipation and indigestion. It provided relief from uric acid. It prevented bladder and kidney stones and generally stopped pain throughout the body, especially when using the restroom. And it also tended to downplay rheumatism and gout. Which is,
Do you have any now?
well, I don't know. So I know I got migraines. I don't know. But I bring this up because what happened was it had lithium in it, and it was called Lithia water, and it was marketed in the 1930s. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and so the government had a lot more regulation on these type of things. And there's scientific evidence that you could. They actually tested Buckhorn Lithium mineral springs, and it would provide health benefits, but you would have to drink. The quote I read, you would have to drink 120 glasses of it a day to get it. But again, something from this area that was unique and of this area. I've got to mention one more house, and I'm going to ask y'all to bear with me on this one because I've been going for a while. But got to talk about Waterloo. Waterloo was the Daniels family house that was located about 2 miles west of here. It was originally built by James Daniel in the 1840s. In 1899, a man named Edward B. Dickerson hit Stovall like nobody's ever hit it before. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. His father was a patent attorney. And I understand he was literally made his money because rather than getting paid by his clients, he always got a share of their profit. To the point where Alexander Graham Bell's phones, Cyrus McCormick's Reaper or tractor, Samuel J. Colt's .45 gun. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. He wanted a getaway place. He lived in New York, but he wanted to come down south and have a quiet place to get away. So he bought Waterloo and added some houses, added on to it. It was 48 rooms. The second largest private house in North Carolina. The only one that had more rooms was Biltmore House, right. It also had, this is a running thing, it also had the world's largest holly tree. So you had the giant pecan tree here, and you also had the world's tallest holly tree, which was about 100 feet high. No, the Bodies live over there at that place now. The house burned about 1962. Ironically enough, when it was being restored. I will say though, he came here, he was the first person to have a car in Stovall. He rigged up a phone from Waterloo to Gregory's store, first phone here. He had his own photography studio. This is in like 1900, 1905, y'all. He had his own motion picture. He would show films. He was one of the first people to show films. He had a paved road or macadam road that went from here all the way to his house at Waterloo. And his wife was the best known fisher woman, fisher person. She was the best female fisherman in the world. He had a yacht, so this is a 363-pound sea bass that she caught off Catalina Island, which was a record. She also caught this tuna in the North Atlantic. Got to tell you the story. His grandfather was a man named Mullen Dickerson, who was Secretary of the Navy. There's a point to this story. Andrew Jackson's head was carved and put on the USS Constitution, the famous sailing ship that's still in Boston Harbor to this day. Now, let me just say this. People in Massachusetts hated Andrew Jackson. He was a big believer in the War of 1812. He was opposed to the tariff abominations, which of course the people in Massachusetts supported, and his greatest political rival was John Quincy Adams from Boston. So, just as a snub to Boston, the Navy Department decided to put Andrew Jackson's carved head on the main mast of the frigate USS Constitution. Well, it wasn't long before somebody went up in the middle of the night, took a saw and cut his head off. Here it is, the figurehead, a tale of horror, and the Constitution is disfigured. Well, Dickerson here inherited it. Somehow it came into his possession through his grandfather, who was Secretary of the Navy, who just kind of neglected to give it back to the United States Navy. And it was here until Dickerson died in 1919. All of the belongings in the house were taken and moved back north. Dickerson himself had gone to Monaco to live in Europe and had died there. The interesting thing was, this was something of a mystery. Whatever happened to Andrew Jackson's head? And of all people, the Secretary of the Navy in the 1920s was a man named Franklin Roosevelt. And when he became president, he got interested in whatever happened to Andrew Jackson's head, the wooden head that was on the Constitution. And there was a man here named Winfield C. Daniel that was the caretaker of Waterloo when Dickerson was there. And the story goes something like this. One day he goes to check his mailbox. And his wife says, "Well, anything interesting come in the mail today?" And he's reading the letter, and there it is right there. "Dear Mr. Daniel, I am quite delighted to know the present whereabouts of the old Hickory's oaken head, which once graced the old frigate Constitution. Sincerely yours, Franklin Roosevelt." There it is right there. So his wife says, "Anything interesting in the mail today?" He said, "Well, not much. I got a letter from the president. He's looking for Andrew Jackson's severed head." And at which point his wife said, "Well, why don't you ask Abraham Lincoln if he knows where it is?" But it's just amazing to me because they found the severed head in the 1940s in Paris, of all places. And then the bottom part of the mouth was missing, and the show History Hunters found it a couple of years ago in upstate New York. And I thought that was just the most interesting story associated with Stovall. Another interesting one is a man named Eugene Harris, grew up here. He was an artist and a designer. He worked for UNC, and he designed the old well. The old well at UNC is designed by somebody from Stovall. Another interesting person from here that went out and about. Tobacco was big here until the 1960s and 70s. Obviously, it's not anymore. We had Granville wilt here in Granville County, which you may be familiar with, which is a bacteria that affects tobacco in a negative kind of way. Each one of these dots represents 10 farms. Look at where it was concentrated. Granville wilt. Finishing up, Stovall School was opened in 1924. The last graduating class there was in 1962. 63. And then everybody went to the consolidated J.F. Webb High School. The school stayed open until the elementary and junior high school was consolidated with Shaw, which was the African American school. The building itself was torn down in 1983. Got to mention Stovall, G.C. Shaw, which was the African American school, part of which still stands to this day. It's where the senior center is. That opened in 1949, closed in 1969, when it was consolidated with Stovall and then into the current school that we have here. In 1952, a man came here to give a poetry reading. His name was Langston Hughes. The great American poet Langston Hughes came to Stovall and had a poetry reading in 1952. Also in 1952, Santa Claus came to Stovall. And this is the reason why I showed it. This is the earliest color picture that I know of the scene from downtown Stovall. I think this is taken by Ulysses Puckett, as a matter of fact. And that's his, him and his brother, I think, ran that. One ran the hardware store, and Ulysses ran the drugstore, which operated until about 2001, I think. A couple other superlatives for Stovall. The first historical marker, G1, John Penn. First one ever put up in North Carolina was put up here in September of 1936. Another first for Stovall, the first Boy Scout troop in the state of North Carolina, opened in 1910. This is only like 8 months after the Boy Scouts had been formed. Incidentally, I think one of these, I think it might be this guy, is Presley Davis. And then this young fellow over here was Zach Williams. He was born in 1900, he died in 1998. And when he was a young man, he was part of the first Boy Scout troop in North Carolina. And when he died, he literally was the oldest Boy Scout in the world. He died at the age of 98. He served in the United States military, became a colonel. In the 1950s, Carl Lake was developed. Of course, this had a profound impact on Stovall and the area here. This is a map, by the way, of every farm pond in Granville County. Granville County has more farm ponds than any other county in North Carolina, which is saying a lot because there are a lot of big counties in North Carolina. And the reason why is Granville County does something really unusual. Most farms, tobacco farms, they have one big pond that you irrigate from. But the story I always heard was people in Granville County didn't want to spend that much money on the pipes. So in order to save money, they built 3 or 4 small ponds on the same farm. And what you could do was the city of Oxford had a bulldozer. It's back in the 40s and 50s, and you could rent it for the weekend. And so you could take it to your farm and give you a few ponds, and there you go. Finishing up, I just want to talk a little bit about Stovall today. This is Isabel. This is the airplane observation tower that was at by Mr. Puckett's drugstore during World War II. The specific thing was to look out for enemy planes. They never saw an enemy plane, though I think there were a lot of times when they thought they saw one. During World War II, of course, you couldn't use your headlights and things like that. And so there were a number of accidents here in Granville County, a couple of fatalities based off of the fact that people were driving around without their headlights on because they didn't want the Germans and the Japanese to see what was going on. In 1973, water came to Stovall. Got to mention Stovall Branch Library. Got to put in a plug for the library. The original Stovall Library was operated in Town Hall in 1954 with 500 volumes. It was originally started by Mrs. Ada Stovall. In 1978, the branch officially opened with 600 volumes to this building right here. Y'all all know this building. As a matter of fact, it was opened on June the 11th, 1968, and it was christened the Harvey J. Stovall Memorial Library. And 4-year-old Ann Cobb Huggins presented the flag that was officially flown over the Capitol in Washington, D.C. I'm glad you were there to do that. Part of Stovall history. In November 2008, an $8 million bond resolution was passed here in Granville County, and this library building was built for $909,000 and opened in March of 2012. These are some people from Stovall. There's John Penn, that's Janet Parrott. Janet, by the way, holds a couple of superlatives herself. She was the youngest person ever elected mayor in North Carolina in 1979 at the age of 24, and she served as mayor for 42 years. She's the longest serving female mayor in the history, I think, of the United States. And she retired in 2022. Anyway, I'm going to close on this note. Stovall, Sassafras-Fort was a farming community. That's changed now. And nowhere can you see that more than in these two comparisons. This is a map from 1940, an aerial map of Stovall. And the thing that strikes me is the amount of farmland. This is a Google map today. And look how much more of it is. Well, first off, we have color now. But look how much of it is not farmland. It's under forestry cover. A little bit about the history of Stovall and Sassafras-Fort. I know I've gone on a long time. Would y'all entertain any questions or anything like that you'd be interested in, or any comments? What I want you to do while you're here, though, please do look at these scrapbooks. Got to give real credit to Herbert Taylor Wilson. He kept a lot of. He preserved a lot of history of Oxford. Granville County and Stovall. Get you done. Grab the other end of this, all right? And Thornton, and the Stovall family has been very generous. They put this scroll together of the Stovall family, including John Walker Stovall, the namesake of Stovall. So you might want to take a look at this too while you're doing that. If you've got any more questions or anything else, and want to learn more about Stovall, please do come to the North Carolina room in the Granville County Library System. Yes,
I just want
Kathy?
to make one comment. John Mark Stovall, for whom the town is named, the sixth consecutive generation in our family now lives in that. I mean, it has been consecutively inhabited by
I remember
Stovall.
that family.
And Mike is the sixth generation.
When you have census records or any indication, things don't change a lot in Stovall. No, that's really neat. I mean, how many families can say that? That it's been in the same family for that long? Because you're talking about, what, over 150 years?
I had a question. Anybody know what Stovall Brick Company was?
Yeah, well, go ahead, Norman.
Actually, there were two Stovall brick companies. One was down on the farm where Catherine grew up. And it didn't last very long. It was started by John Walker Stovall. But there was no railroad here at that time, and he couldn't get his bricks to market.
Yeah, that'd be a heavy load.
That went out of business. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, down here, do you remember where my dad's pond was, Kate? That was the clay pit for the Stovall Brick Company that produced those bricks. And it was run by the Burwell family here in Stovall. And it operated from the late 1800s until about 1910. But that's where it was, down there where that pond was, and the bricks were made right there on the corner, right 50 feet from the railroad. They learned that lesson.
Didn't he have a plow factory too?
What?
Didn't Stovall have a plow factory?
Yeah.
He was quite the entrepreneur, I think.
Oh, where's the boating home? Is that on Crescent Creek Road?
Yeah, it's like Waterloo, the one I'm
Yeah.
talking, yeah. You take, it's the left back over there. Actually, there used to be a road that would go straight by the high school, went straight through there. That was the Macadam Road. But it's back over off of, and by the way, it's kind of up on a hill, almost like there was a post office at Waterloo, and then they decided to move it to Bullock's Crossroads. Or later on, when it was Gregory Mill, when I remember I was mentioning Gregory Mill, the post office moved over there from Waterloo.
It was a man from Henderson, I can't think of his name, you know what I'm talking about. He had that farm before, it's been.
Charlie Rhodes.
Charlie Rhodes lived there.
Yeah, Charlie Rose from,
He lived on that farm.
yeah, and it's funny you mentioned him because I found a copy of the Henderson Bulldog, the high school newspaper from 1961, and he was the sports reporter. So that was his first gig in news.
He went on to be on TV.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Well, anyway, y'all come and take a look at some of this stuff while you're here, all right?
Is there anything left
The tree is shown, the caretaker's house. We know about where it was. Palm trees is gonna, palm trees gonna.
I remember in 1962 when that happened, birthday, we rode the bicycles up there. We rode the bicycles.
Yeah.
It was called it.
Library right here. You always